like to welcome you to today's panel on behalf of the Office of Public Affairs of the Baha'i Community of Canada. I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to celebrate the wonderful day that is International Women's Day. We're right about the mark of 100 participants, and the numbers just keep going up. So that's really wonderful to have such a great turnout. My name is Afsoon Houshidari, and I will be acting as your moderator today. I work as legal counsel for the federal government, initially at the Department of Justice, and now with the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. Though these days I have the privilege of being a full-time mother to our 16-month-old daughter. The impact of the pandemic has been far-reaching in our lives, but one of its blessings is that we can gather together from many different places. I would like to acknowledge the land on which I stand today, the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, in particular the Anishinaabeg, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples. I'm grateful to welcome you from this land. The event today is hosted by the Office of Public Affairs, as I mentioned, which represents the Baha'i Community of Canada on a national stage. This office convenes conversations that are important to our community and to Canada as a whole. And the principle of the equality of men and women is an indispensable element of the Baha'i teachings. Indeed, the Baha'i scriptures tell us that the world of humanity is possessed of two wings, the male and the female. So long as these two wings are not equivalent in strength, the bird will not fly. Until womankind reaches the same degree as man, until she enjoys the same arena of activity, extraordinary achievement for all humanity will not be realized, and humanity cannot wing its way to the heights of real attainment. This day, the International Women's Day in 2022, is a momentous one. It's been over a century that the idea of a day dedicated to women was initially conceived by socialists, illustrating the recognition, I think, that the problem of gender equality is intimately related to the problem of economic equality. And so much has happened on this International Women's Day over the years. There have been really historic ones. I am thinking of the one in 1917, where thousands of Russian women took to the streets demanding change, and the unified action that they took proved an essential element in women being granted voting rights shortly thereafter. I also think of this day in 1979 in Iran, when planned celebrations were transformed overnight into massive demonstrations after Khomeini announced the day before that the veil would be mandatory as part of his revolution. Women shouted, "Without the liberation of women, the revolution is meaningless." And so while we gather today on Zoom, and it may seem anticlimactic to do so, and I know we can't see one another, we know that we're part of a movement that has its roots going back for decades, and that will go into the future with, I think, extraordinary outcomes in the years to come. So let's look at that future. Today's panel asks us to imagine a future of gender equality. And so we're going to delve deep through the insights of our panelists into the following questions. How would the full application of the principle of equality between the sexes transform the way in which we organize our social, our political, and our economic life? How can we envision a future of gender equality where the barriers to participation by women in the affairs of society are removed? These questions will be illuminated by three panelists, each of whom bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to us today. They are Senator Marilou McPhedran, who has spent over 4 decades working as a human rights lawyer and educator, specializing in teaching and developing systematic and sustainable change mechanisms to promote equality and diversity. She co-founded LEAF, the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, founded the International Women's Rights Project at York University, and has chaired 3 independent inquiries into sexual abuse of patients, among many of her notable achievements. In 2016, she was appointed to the Senate of Canada. Our second speaker is Ms. Ana Serrano, who is President and Vice-Chancellor of OCAD University in Toronto. She is an innovator and global visionary leader in digital media, having received numerous awards from the digital media, film, and theater industries in both Canada and the United States. Anna also has a commitment to human rights and sits on the board of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. Our final panelist is Ms. Natalia Rodriguez, a partner at Conway Baxter LLP, a boutique litigation firm in Ottawa where she practices civil litigation and dispute resolution. Natalia actively contributes to discourse on issues of diversity and inclusion in the judiciary and in the legal profession, for instance, through the Canadian Hispanic Bar Association, the Law Society of Ontario's Equity Advisory Group, and the Advocates Society's Diversity and Inclusion Standing Committee. And so now I will turn it over to our speakers, each of whom will share their thoughts for about 7 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have time for question and answers. So please, whether throughout the panel or at the end, submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And so without further ado, I invite our first speaker, Senator McPhedran, to take the floor.
I think you can hear me now. Hello, bonjour Tanzi. En tant que sénatrice du Manitoba, je reconnais que je vis sur le territoire des traités 1, le territoire traditionnel des Anishtabeg, des Cris, des Ojikri, des Dakota et des Dene, et la patrie de la nation métisse. And I acknowledge that the Parliament of Canada is situated on the unsurrendered territory of the Anishtabeg and Algonquin First Nations. I want to thank the Baha'i community of Canada, and I want to thank you, Afsoon, for the kind introduction. And I want to express how honored I am to be on this panel with Anna and Natalia and Afsoon. It means a lot to be invited to speak openly and honestly about this day, but also this time. My mornings generally start early, and they generally start with messages from women in Afghanistan, still trapped, still trying to escape, and now also some of my colleagues, women parliamentarians, primarily in Ukraine. They are trapped by the aggression of Russia. They are not trying to escape. The Ukrainian women parliamentarians that I'm in communication with are standing and fighting and determined that this will not be the essentially end of democracy for our world. And what I want to share with you, in addition just to the angst and the heartache over this and the astonishment to some degree over this, is to invite us all to think really seriously about the Security Council resolutions built around the initial Security Council Resolution 1325 from the year 2000, where we now have a whole suite of Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, and more recently, a growing suite of resolutions on youth, peace, and security. And to the questions that were posed to us as panelists, I would say the overarching guiding principle needs to be intersectionality and accessibility. And within that is the very practical, rock hard, it seems, reality that most of us everywhere in the world are still working primarily within patriarchal institutions. I say this to you as a woman senator in Canada, where we are only the second country in the world to achieve gender parity in our Senate. And yet, I would say to you, there's a big distinction between gender parity and still struggling with deeply entrenched patriarchal bones in the skeleton of this institution. And I don't think we're that different from most institutions in most places in the world. And so when we see women's leadership, whether it's at the community level, whether it's at the government level, or whether it's at the corporate level, I think we need to bring not only the desire to find ways to find common ground, but we also need to really be mindful of the fact that every single one of those women will be struggling with some form, obvious or not so obvious, of patriarchy. And what we're seeing right now in Ukraine, and what we've seen in Yemen, in Sudan, in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, Myanmar, what's still happening in Myanmar, what we are seeing is a tilt in our world away from democracy. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that to the extent that we've seen significant progress in women's leadership, for the most part, we've seen that progress in democracies. So this is a time not only of great fear and infuriation and frustration over the aggression that is playing out in front of all of our eyes in Ukraine, but what this means overall for our world. And so I'm struggling today with answering the questions put to us about what it would mean to actually see a world where there was functional gender equality that was actually allowing every member of every society to fully live their human rights. That's my 6-minute mark. And I think at this point, I will just close off because I'm very interested in the conversation that we're going to be having as part of this panel. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you, Senator McPhedran, for bringing our attention to what is currently happening in the world, the realities that men and women are facing in so many different countries, and the impact of the tilt away from democracy on the goal of gender equality. Thank you for those comments. Our next speaker is Anna Serrano. I'd like to invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Afsoon, and thank you very much, Senator McPhedran, for those heartfelt words, which I just honestly absorbed and felt so deeply too. One of the things that I'm equally invested in is democracy. As part of the things that I'm engaged with beyond the academy is I've had the pleasure of being co-chair of the Open Democracy Project for the past 4 years and have been co-directing the Democracy Exchange, indeed where I met Jeff and Laura. So thank you very much to the Baha'i community of Canada for this invitation. And I'm deeply honored to be speaking with all you three today. You know, when I was asked this question, like you, Senator, I had a hard time answering it and figuring out whether I should take the artistic and design approach and provide you with a sort of a speculative fiction story of what this wonderful future might be. You'll be happy to note that I erred away from that particular path. Instead, you know, as I've been reading different things preparing for this, I came across two thoughts by two seemingly different people, and I'd like to share them with you to kind of start my remarks. The first one is this phrase: the idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong in the world. So this was a quote by Dr. Paul Farmer, who has recently passed. He's a renowned infectious disease specialist, humanitarian, and healthcare champion for many of the world's most vulnerable patient populations, and co-founder of the Boston-based global non-for-profit Partners in Health. So I just want you to sit with that. The idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong in the world. The second kind of set of thoughts that I've been playing around with or have struck me is from this book that I'm currently reading by a young feminist, Lola Olufemi, who's a Black feminist writer and organizer from London, England. In the introduction to her book called Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power, she reminds us, feminism is a political project about what could be. It's always looking forward, investing in futures we can't quite grasp yet. Feminism, in a sense, is a way to think about the limits of this world and the possibilities contained in the ones we could craft together. So as I think about those two phrases or those words, it really struck me almost in a reductive way, the fact that there is power to ideas, right? We, on the one hand, in Paul Farmer's phrase, he talks about how an idea, this idea of people being less than, has given life to systems of oppression, right? On the other hand, feminism is a set of ideas that can carve a path towards dismantling these same systems. So in 2002, and this is, has been reflected already by Senator McPhedran so eloquently, you know, as we continue to live with and in this pandemic, as the inequities of the world are amplified, as more bodies of Indigenous children are found across Canada, as war rages on in the Ukraine, we can all observe and know in our bones that we have been in the middle of a very specific struggle for a very long time. And I think it's this struggle of this particular idea. And the idea is that we want to get everyone committed to building a world where no lives matter less than others. Certainly where no women's lives matter less than men's. And many of you here today have devoted your entire careers to the rehabilitation and or dismantling of systems, of those systems which perpetuate such inequities and injustices. Some of you have focused on the legal system, on the governance system, on health, educational, economic systems, and corporate sector, not-for-profit, and so on. Today, because of where I come from, I'd like to speak a little bit about technology. Because we really can't envision a future of gender equality where the barriers to participation by women in the affairs of society are removed if we don't turn our attention to the technology underpinning much of society today. So the first thing that I think we all need to understand is that technology is not neutral. Digital networked media and technology. So what does that mean? The internet, the mobile phones, sensors, fiber optics, they simply extend our capacity to organize society and unfortunately have either amplified the challenges that already exist in the world, or in some cases, actually further exacerbated these problems. We only have to turn our attention to the ongoing tribunals of Facebook and how that particular social media platform and those platforms that profit on the amplification of polarized debates and misinformation and disinformation have clearly destabilized democratic societies around the world. I'm Filipino, so I know that just before Duterte was elected the first time around, before Trump was elected, we could already see the machinations of those social media platforms wending their way towards the destabilization of my country, followed thereafter by Brexit, followed thereafter by Trump being elected. And people like Maria Reza, Nobel Prize winning journalist in the Philippines, pointed at these systems and these paths that she saw and said, we need to do something about this. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some examples of the ways in which technology infrastructure and its attendant ecosystems of supports are contributing to gender inequality. First of all, there's direct harm. So tech-enabled gender-based violence, online harassment, hate speech, etc. Canadian Women's Foundation has, in the Statistics Canada survey, reported that while people of all genders experience cyber violence, girls are at a greater risk of experiencing violence online, especially severe types of harassment and abuse. And in 2009, 67% of victims of police reported intimidation on the internet were from women and girls. I'll just talk about one more, indirect harm, which is misuse of data and tech. So as articulated by Stephanie Mickelson in Engineering for Change, misuse of data or tech can take many forms: algorithmic bias, data security, etc. Afsoon, you can ask me about those later. But what does this mean then? So not to be reductive, we basically have a design problem. If we want to build a world where gender equality and indeed full equality for all is the goal, we need to come up with a design process as how to we will do this together. So who's involved in this process? Where is the edge? We need to understand what systems to unpack and what enabling tools and processes, including technology, underpin such systems. And we need to ask how we turn critique into action. The good news is there's a ton of work that's being done, perhaps too slowly. And there's a number of, especially women academics and scholars who are doing this work, which I will share with you in the chat. But this just kind of sets it out in terms of where we think we're at, where I think we're at in terms of technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. There's so much in there that you've talked about that is fascinating in terms of the impact of data systems, how they're created, and how they might be biased, which I'll ask you about later, and what kind of design systems we really need to unpack to arrive at this goal of gender equality. Thank you very much. Our third and final speaker is Natalia Rodriguez. Natalia, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to thank my esteemed panelists for their remarks and our moderator, Afsoon, as well as the Baha'i Community of Canada for inviting me to speak today. There are several areas in which more work has to be done with respect to the full participation of women in society. And specifically, I wanted to look at the justice system and the legal profession being that being kind of my area. So outside of my regular client work, I am heavily involved in diversity and inclusion issues within the legal profession. And so much of my perspective comes from working within those circles, as well as my own personal experience in the legal profession as a woman with intersecting identities, including being Hispanic and a member of the Baha'i faith religious minority. So I wanted to talk a little bit about women in the legal profession. Now, as most of you are probably aware, for centuries, the legal profession was closed to women. And it wasn't until the late 19th century that a few trailblazing women began to break down those barriers and pave the way for thousands of women lawyers who have since sought careers in the profession. There's been a huge influx of young women seeking careers in law since about the 1970s. However, the increased number of women graduating from law schools has not translated into more women at the highest levels of the profession. So in Canada, for example, the number of women joining the legal profession continues to grow, and women account for almost 60% of Ontario's youngest lawyers. On average, however, the number of women partners at most law firms, which is the partnership is kind of the highest level of the firm, making all of the decisions and sharing in all the profits, that remains at about 20% women only. Now, in 2010, there was a report commissioned by the Law Society of Ontario to understand the dynamics going on here. And that study revealed that women lawyers make 20 to 30% less than their male counterparts and are significantly less likely to be partners in private practice. So there's a common misconception that women leave private practice because they want to start a family or because they want more work-life balance. And that may be true for some women, but I think this only tells part of the story. Ultimately, women want to be in a workplace, any workplace really, that is supportive of their career goals, that has a path to advancement, and in which they feel valued. And what studies have shown is that a significant factor of why law firms lose so many women is that there is simply not enough effective mentoring and sponsorship of women associates. And for those of you who don't know, the associates are the salaried lawyers who do not have any kind of management responsibilities and don't have any decision-making authority and don't share in the profits. So what's been found is that women need sponsors in the profession. So they need individuals who will recommend them for assignments, who will give them opportunities, who will support them in promotions, and who are essentially willing to leverage their own power and reputation to help women succeed. Now, from my own personal experience as an associate at a large national firm for many years, I faced many of these same barriers, and I saw many of my women colleagues struggle with the same issues. For example, at the height of the Me Too movement, some partners expressed that they didn't feel comfortable mentoring women for fear that they may be accused of impropriety. So, the reasons why many male partners are not effectively mentoring women are probably varied. But when most partners are men and most associates are women, and there's a hesitation to bring women up, you can see how it is that women are not getting the opportunities that they need to be successful and feel fulfilled in the profession. So, why are more women in leadership positions important? Well, first of all, it's good for business. So studies have shown that companies in the top, 25% of gender diversity are also 15% more likely to have above average financial returns. But aside from the financial benefits to firms, studies also show that more women included in a leadership team means that the team is more likely to be successful. And more female members on a team significantly enhances the collective intelligence of that team. Now, many of these studies also echo the teachings of the Baha'i faith with respect to societal benefits of gender equality. The Baha'i faith teaches that women and men can only achieve their full potential when both have equal opportunities to grow and develop. And when women are equal in participation, influence, and strength in all areas of society, then the full economic and social development of the world becomes a possibility. Now, in my view, this applies with as much strength, if not more, to our justice system. So leaders in the legal profession have significant influence over the types of causes that are championed, the cases that end up at the Supreme Court of Canada, and generally moving the legal profession forward. So full inclusion of women in the legal profession will help to make the justice system more just. So right now, in my view, we have a legal system, but not so much a justice system. And it's because it simply doesn't work for so many people. And I think part of the reason we don't have a true system of justice is because it wasn't built by a representative cross-section of our society. Diverse members of society, including half of the population, have been systematically excluded from full participation in this system. So that is changing, but in my view, not nearly quickly enough. So how do we get there? I think representation is very important to see women at the highest levels of the legal profession. We need more and better mentorship, sponsorship, and allyship. And that's something that each of us can do within our own sphere of influence, no matter where you work or where you are. We need flexible work environments. We need work from home arrangements, which COVID has now given us an opportunity to explore. And we need to change fundamentally how we conceive the practice of law. So things are changing, but not as quickly, I would say, in the private sphere. In the public arena, for example, in government, I think women are making a lot more strides. And that leads me to the second area I wanted to quickly cover today. And I may not get to the third, and that's fine. Maybe we can leave that for a question. And in any event, the second area is women in the judiciary. So this is another area which I feel we need to improve the status of women in, and that's going to lead to a more just society. So historically, female representation in the judiciary in Canada has been very poor, given that women's participation in the legal profession has been low until the last few decades. Also, there have been barriers to women achieving the highest levels of the profession, which would then make them eligible for judicial appointments. Now, in the last 5 years, however, there has been a dramatic change in the judiciary in terms of gender balance. 2017 was the first year that more women than men were federally appointed to the judiciary. And this trend has continued and has contributed to the fact that as of March 1st of this year, 44% of all sitting federally appointed judges are women. So we're not at gender parity, but we're getting closer. But I think there's intersectional forms of equity to consider here as well. So for instance, how many of the judges, women judges, are Indigenous women or racialized women or women with disabilities? A judiciary that reflects all communities and all of their diversities is so critical. And so for now, we know that most women on the judiciary are white, able-bodied, straight women. So not necessarily representative of all women in our society. So in my view, full participation of women in the judiciary would improve the way that the justice system deals with many issues. For example, issues of gender-based violence, which is just one, but there are so many issues that could be advanced if women had full participation, and all cross-section of women had full participation in the judiciary. And I will leave my final comment maybe for later, and those are just my comments for now since I am out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for those really comprehensive remarks outlining the legal and judicial system, its deficiencies, and how we could actually go about achieving greater gender equality. So I'm going to ask you about that third element that you didn't have time for. But I would like to start with a question for Senator McPhedran. Senator McPhedran, you'd indicated that Canada is only second in the world after Australia to achieve gender parity in its parliament, its Senate, but that this indicator, perhaps what we might see as an obvious indicator, I mean, Natalia just alluded to representation as being necessary, as being one of the first steps in terms of achieving gender equality. You'd mentioned that despite this, that you think, the system of patriarchy continues undermining true gender equality. Could you tell us a little bit about how that is, and what, in addition to such representation, you see as needed, for example, in the Senate? Having already achieved this gender parity, what more is there that we can strive for?
Well, I would start by noting that what I didn't fully say was that the maintenance, the promotion of the deeply entrenched patriarchy in the institution where I work, the Senate, is often as actively promoted and protected and sustained by women senators, as by men who are senators. And I think this is a relatively recent opportunity for us as a society to understand better this distinction between the patriarchy of an institution and gender parity, or gender not necessarily being the primary driving force. And I say this tentatively because I'm paying close attention to what's happening around me in the place where I work. But tentatively, I would say that much more than just the simplicity of what sex you may claim, it really has more to do with your identification of holding on to privilege. And that's not even a category, that we can list in our research. How do you measure that? What I see around me, and I really do want to pay tribute to some specific women senators that I think are working so diligently and brilliantly in challenging a lot of this hidden, deeply entrenched patriarchy. I would, for example, note and applaud my sister senator, who's the only residential school survivor in the Senate, Senator Mary Jane McCollum, who has very bravely challenged other senators, challenged some of the senatorial groupings, the cliquish way in which the Senate is organized, and has pointed out and given very specific examples of lateral violence, gender-based lateral violence. I would also give a shout out to my sister Senator Rosemary Moody, who've almost, I mean, she was for a short time in the Senate, and she became the co-chair of the Black Caucus of Parliamentarians that brings together senators and MPs. It's that kind of risking that we have to be prepared to take. And let me go a little bit further, and here this is more of a personal note. We really have to be prepared to be disliked. We have to be prepared to disrupt. We have to be prepared to make people who are very privileged and comfortable less comfortable.
Thank you for those profound thoughts. The idea of identifying the holding on to of privilege, the unwillingness to let go of privilege, and what is needed from everyone, from many different aspects of society or professions, to kind of foster an environment that might be a bit bumpy in terms of having people let go of privileges. And we all have different privileges, whether or not we're aware of them. It's not necessarily, as we were saying, the most obvious indicators. There's many different ones. Thank you for bringing up that really poignant comment. Anna, I wanted to ask you about something you alluded to in your remarks, but before I do, let me say that the question and answers is open to everyone in the audience, and we have quite a large number of participants with us today. So please feel free to put your comments in the chat section, and I will be able to pose them to our speakers, whether it's to one panelist or all of them. So please feel free. In the meantime, I do have a whole slew of questions. So let me go ahead and pose one to Anna. Anna, you talked about data bias and the way algorithms are constructed in terms of part of the indirect harm that's done through technology to gender equality. This might be news to a lot of people who don't really understand the underpinnings of how technology and media work. Could you talk to us about that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that is very difficult, I think, for most people to really inhabit or embody is the neutrality of technology. It is not, or their perceived notion that technology is neutral. But these are simply structures that are built by society, and often the kinds of biases that exist in society are transported into the way these now technical systems are made. So in the case of, for example, algorithmic bias, you have coded in machine learning language and in artificial intelligence systems certain biases about essentially what Senator McPhedran has spoken about privilege, for example, and power, who has it, who should be afforded it, etc. And there's a number of really important scholars. Thank you, Senator, for shouting out to your senator sisters. I'd like to do the same. Some feminist technology scholars like Dr. Sophia Noble, who's the Internet Studies Scholar and Professor of Gender Studies and African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and she wrote the seminal book, Algorithms of Oppression, where she clearly showed how you search on Google, who you are and what search terms you use on Google determine the kinds of results you get. And certain results are prioritized for perceived sections of society. So if you happen to be searching using an African-American name, then certain search results, especially the ad-supported section of the search page, would be fed to you. So this is an example of data sets being used that have encoded upon them certain biases. Another very important scholar is Virginia Eubanks, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Albany, and she is the author of Automating Inequality: How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor, and so on. So there's actually quite a bit of the underpinning of technology from the data that's used to run algorithms that algorithms use as the raw materials, being biased in and of themselves, and then the algorithmic equations themselves having a biased construction. So we need to pay attention to those things.
Thank you very much, Anna. A question for Natalia. You talked about the lack currently of full participation of women in the judiciary. Thinking about the future and the aspirational part of this panel, if we were to achieve that, the full panel of women in the judiciary, how do you think it would affect women as a whole in society?
Yes, thanks for the question, Afsoon. I think there's probably a lot of different areas that we might not even think of today sitting here that would be affected if women had full participation in the judiciary. And, you know, I take Senator McPhedran's comments to heart when she says, you know, representation is not sufficient. You can't just have parity and expect that everything is going to be fine. There's obviously issues of, you know, power dynamics, who has the privilege, who stands to lose from losing their privilege. And I completely and wholeheartedly agree with that. I think gender parity in our judiciary is a first step, but it's certainly not the last step. I think there's so much more work that needs to be done. Education is a big part of it, I think. But, you know, so when I say full participation of women, I mean not just in a token way, if I can put it that way, but real and meaningful participation. I think it would really improve the way that the justice system deals with many issues. And one such issue, for example, is gender-based violence. And that's just one of probably many examples that would be affected. For example, you know, family law issues would probably have a different view to them if women were full and meaningful participants in the judiciary. Excuse me, hard to get that word out. So, you know, with respect to gender-based violence, for example, you know, the statistics we know are pretty stark. Every 6 days, a woman in Canada is killed by her intimate partner. You know, women are 5 times more likely than men to experience sexual assault. And, you know, historically, the Criminal Code of Canada had provisions in them that were actually harmful to women who testified in sexual assault trials as victims of violence. There were major changes to the Criminal Code in 1982, and to some extent that situation was addressed, but there were still very much systemic barriers to women seeking justice. You know, another example is domestic violence. That has always almost been against women and children. And for a long time, it was considered to be a private matter in Canada. So even though partner violence is a form of assault and is punishable under the criminal code, the social attitudes of the day meant that police were very reluctant to intervene in domestic disputes. And courts hesitated to find a husband guilty of assault against his wife unless there was a third-party witness that was there and saw it happen. So that has changed, but we have seen recent examples of courts having antiquated views of consent and making comments suggesting that an assault is the victim's fault. So there was one such notorious case that people may be aware of that led to the judge's resignation in 2017. And that was because the court transcripts revealed that the judge questioned the sexual assault victim's morals and said her attempts to fight off the attack were ineffectual, essentially blaming her for the attack, saying, well, you didn't do enough to fend it off. And on multiple occasions, he referred to her as the accused. So there's clearly a lot more work that has to be done here. So we can envision a future in which these kinds of comments don't happen. These types of decisions aren't made based on assumptions about women, about consent, about how they should look, how they should dress. So to me, it's an inescapable conclusion that women's full and meaningful participation and leadership in the judiciary will alter women's status before the law, and which can only lead to a more just and civil society.
Thank you, Natalia. Senator McPhedran, I see your hand up.
I am moved to respond to Natalia's points, and I thank you for them, Natalia. But I want to suggest, and I've been a lawyer for 44 years, I want to suggest that if we focus on the judiciary, we are not going to see the kind of changes that we hope to see in terms of day-to-day living of rights. And the reason I say that is summed up in one word: activism. And what judges, for the most part, can't do is be activists. And that is what changes the paradigm. It's when there's pushback, it's when there's organizing. That's why myself and many more women lawyers early in our career founded the National Association of Women in the Law. That's why we founded the Legal Education and Action Fund as an equality rights defense fund in the legal system. It's the activism, being able to speak out, being able to criticize, being able to mount demonstrations, writing campaigns, etc. That's what changes the paradigm. So I would just ask that when we talk about making change, we remember that. It's when you're prepared to take to the streets in one form or another that you actually will start to see systemic changes.
Thank you, Senator. There are indeed many elements and ways of making change. Natalia, I want to pose a question to you from the audience, because you referred to education in your comments, and also because I know in your past that prior to entering the legal profession, you were a teacher. And this participant has posed the following. It seems that there is a dearth of awareness about gender equality and related matters in society in general. How much can education, elementary or secondary, in gender studies be a helpful foundational way to increase awareness of the general population going forward for an overall just and compassionate society?
Thanks for the question, Afsoon, and for the member of the audience who posed it. Absolutely, education is essential. I think many of the kind of lingering issues that we see that every generation we think, okay, well, with the next generation, surely this won't be an issue anymore. They're much more open-minded, and this will not be an issue 2 generations from now. But then we find that these issues are pervasive from generation to generation. And that is an issue of education, either lack of positive education about gender issues, gender studies, equality, matters of equality, moral education, spiritual education, realizing that we are all equal members of society, or we should be all equal members of society, and also possibly negative education. So passing on our biases to the next generation, passing on our prejudices, passing on our discriminatory thinking. And so to me, that is really the key to everything, is education. From a young age, children should be raised to see other children as their equals and their friends, and you should be friends with everybody. And you should really learn to be empathetic and feel, other children's pain. I'm reminded of a program that was around when I was a teacher, and it was in order to essentially teach empathy in children. And I'm having just a moment now where I can't remember the name of the program, but essentially what it was the class would bring in a volunteer mother with a new baby, and the baby would be maybe 8 or 9 months old. It could crawl around, and the children would sit around in a circle and see this baby crawling around, would interact with the baby. The mother would talk about, what does the baby do during the day, and how do I take care of the baby? And it was a way to teach empathy in children. And so, when we teach empathy, then it's a natural feeling to want to ensure that all of us are elevated in society in the manner that we should be. And people intervene when they see things that are not right, when they see behaviors that are going against those principles of equality and justice. And so to me, education really is the key to everything. And that's just one small example of how the education system does realize that empathy is something that can be taught, and they're incorporating it into the school system.
I'm seeing some members of the audience tell us that the program name is called Roots of Empathy.
Thank you. I knew it had the word empathy in it, but I was like, Hands of Empathy? No, something else. Roots of Empathy, that's the one.
Thank you to our audience members. I'd like to give Anna a chance to reply. I see your hand up. And at the same time, I'd like to pose you another question from one of our participants. I wonder if you can weave them together. The question is, when you talked about algorithms, can they censor certain words to protect social media users from misconduct? This seems a very practical suggestion to me, as we think of small practical ways to advance along our goal, not necessarily reaching perfection, but having progress along the way. So I'll pose that question to you and also give you an opportunity to respond to this conversation.
Sure, I promise to respond to that question. But what struck me with your intervention, Senator, on activism, which I wholeheartedly agree with, and the question around education is that, the problem we all face is that not everything is always just one thing. So I talk about the perils of technology, but at the same time, technology is a great space for activist education. And so, for example, I've been laughing all day because today the gender Parity bot was unleashed on the internet. I don't know if you folks have heard about it, but basically in the UK, as each corporation sends out their congratulations or greetings or self-congratulatory pats on the back about what they're doing for International Women's Day, if they use the hashtag International Women's Day IWD 2022, the bot takes the data of their salary data sets and will tweet out, "Oh, well, thanks, Nestle, for that tweet, but your women median average salary is 25% less than men's." And so that's been going along all across Twitter. So there are these kinds of really rebellious and revolutionary activist moments that educate, and it's really education in the form of cultural transformation, because ultimately I think that's what we need to equally focus on. Is there's the obvious technical and clearly legal frameworks that we must be changed, systems that must be changed. But if you don't have the attendant cultural shift alongside that, it's very difficult to actually make that happen. So in the case of the question around the algorithm, I don't think censorship is the answer, unfortunately. I do think that I think regulation is the answer. I think that technology firms cannot grow into large monopolies so that they can just do whatever they want. And I think technology firms should not have business models which are predicated on feeding off the most primal, primitive impulses of human society to only want to align themselves with the most emotionally emotional content as a way for them to create profits. So it's really an issue of regulation that we need to pay attention to. So that's why when you read the papers and people talk about, well, we can just moderate this content or moderate that, many of the technology activists out there will say that's not actually going far enough.
Thank you, Anna. We have a slew of questions from the audience and very little time, so I'm going to combine two of the questions, and I wonder if I can pose them initially to you, Senator. They actually link to what you just mentioned, Anna, about the cultural impact, like the influence of culture on this kind of change. One is in French. I'll read it for our audience. Ma question est de savoir comment on peut toucher le côté de l'émancipation de la femme dans les villages, lorsqu'en Afrique, certains n'oublient pas, soi-disant, que c'est leur coutume, et même beaucoup de femmes cautionnent l'inégalité. So talking about customs and villages, and another participant kind of echoed this, that women in her church environment, that they were having the impact that you talked about, that other women sometimes continue these kinds of inequalities, perhaps even inadvertently. So in looking at that question that was posed to us in French about some women not forgetting that it's their custom, and that, historical and cultural factors kind of support inequality. How can we address this? It seems to be a real aspect of life, whether here in Canada in the Senate or in the villages of Africa. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you like 1 to 2 minutes.
No, yes.
Extremely deep and profound question.
Thank you. Well, that was my concern. I was seeing the time go, and I was thinking I don't want to gobble up time from other panelists. So let me just say very quickly that both of those questions touch on what happens every day on the front lines, for the most part with those who are not in positions of power and authority. And the change comes about when those women on the front lines are heard and respected and are integrated into action to try and make systemic change.
Thank you very much. It's really impressive that you managed to give a quick yet profound answer to this question. I have to apologize to those of the participants whose questions we didn't have time to answer today. Really illuminating conversation, and I feel like we could go on for another hour or two answering all of these questions and really learning from one another. But unfortunately, our time is coming to an end. So I would like to thank our speakers, Senator Marilou McPhedran, Anna Serrano, and Natalia Rodriguez. I'd also like to thank the event's host, the Office of Public Affairs of the Baha'i Community of Canada. Please subscribe to our newsletter to hear about future events related to these important themes. We have these types of conversations on an ongoing basis, and there's going to be one upcoming actually to commemorate the UN Commission on the Status of Women. The link to the newsletter has been sent out in our chat box. And finally, I would like to thank all of you for coming to today's events, for your questions, for absorbing the insights that we've received. And I know that once again, I've said we can't see one another right now, but we are really part of a movement, each of us like a drop in a sea. And we're hoping that this sea will swell and that the tide of equality of men and women will triumph over the shores of the world, here at home and abroad. So with hopes of a brighter future for all, I'd like to thank you all once again and wish you a wonderful day, a wonderful 2022 International Women's Day. Take care. Thank you.